Hi everyone, I'm Nitsa Hone, and it's Saturday. That means it's time for Nitsa Notes, my weekly vlog series about limited magic. We're pretty deep in Thunder Junction now, and for that reason I wanted to do sort of a retrospective episode, a top 10 list. I do like doing those here on the channel, but obviously this is an unscripted one, as this is Nitsa Notes, where I just, talk about stuff. I have a list, but I'm just going to talk about it. And I wanted to look at what the 10 commons are, going back as far back as I could in 17 Lands data, what the top 10 commons are in terms of game in hand win rate, because I thought it would be an interesting jumping off point to talk about, what makes commons good. And some of these are old enough that we can also talk about how things have changed now, what's different about formats and things like that. We don't quite have every set that's ever been on Magic Arena. We don't quite have enough data for them right now on 17 Lands, because I don't know when 17 Lands started, but I'd say it feels like 2020 or so. And so we have some older sets that are on Arena, like a couple of core sets, and the original Eldraine, which either haven't been flashback drafts or haven't been enough that we don't have enough data to talk about them. So those sets are disregarded. But almost every set that's ever been available on Arena, and every set that's been available for the last 4+ years or so, is available. And so I have the 10 commons from those sets with the highest win rates. As usual, I recommend you check out 17 Lands. You can go to 17lands.com, sign up to have them track your data. It's a great place to just, get information about limited formats. Data is never perfect. It's never going to tell you the whole story, but it is helpful. All right, let's dive into the list of the top 10 commons for Magic Arena Limited over the last 4 or so years. So first up, we've got Healer's Hawk, which had a win rate of 61.6% in guilds of Ravnica. So, yeah. Going back and looking at this card is interesting because this might have been sort of the moment where they started to shift how they design 1-drops. They started to really push them. Because 1-mana 1/1 flying lifelink is pretty pushed. Even then, it didn't look like a card that would have, this high of a win rate, right? But there were some things going on in Guilds of Ravnica that made it work. For one thing, the biggest thing was just, it was super easy to buff it. And if you start buffing a thing with flying and lifelink, it quickly runs away with the game. I do remember in my set review not being ultra impressed with this, and that's because we were still in a world where 1-drops almost were always bad and limited back in 2018, when this originally came out. Obviously, they're mostly not anymore, although they are a little weaker in Thunder Junction than they have been in a while, but there's still some pretty darn good ones. But yeah, Healer's Hawk was a great one. And, 1-mana 1/1 flying a lifelink is always going to be a really good common in faster sets that have ways to buff creatures. The most obvious way to do it, by the way, in this set was with the Mentor mechanic, which was the Boros mechanic, and that made it, exceedingly simple to play, Blade Instructor on turn 3, attack with it and the 1/1, it becomes a 2/2. If they don't kill your Instructor, it's going to be a 3/3 on the next turn, so usually they have to block. You can just set up all kinds of turns where things went really, really well for this creature. And, you shouldn't underestimate how good Flying and Lifelink are together. They are, I don't know what the best, First Strike and Death Touch are probably the best 2-keyword combination there is, I guess. But because, that's just auto kill everything. Can't be blocked. You can't attack through it, right? But Flying and Lifelink, in terms of what kind of effect they have on a game, is huge. Obviously the flying means the creature's evasive, but a creature that has Lifelink and flying is going to be able to get in for damage really easily, and that's a big deal, because every time a creature with Lifelink hits the opponent, the gap between your life total and your opponent's, or whichever way you want to look at it, is double that amount of damage. So you end up really altering a race in a big way. Even just a 1/1 hitting for 1 damage for 3 turns is a way bigger effect than it seems when you're also gaining 3 life at the same time. And so then when you put counters on it with the Mentor mechanic in this case, or augmented in any other way, shape, and form, you start getting insane value every time you hit your opponent, and the race is quickly just completely out of reach. Right, at number 9, we've got Academy Journey Mage. It also had a 61.6% win rate. It's from Dominaria. That's of these sets, Guilds of Ravnica is an older set too that we've seen a decent number of flashbacks for. But for Dominaria, we see flashbacks. We've seen flashbacks the most. We have the most data of these older sets, from 2018, 2019, of any of them. And Academy Journey Mage comes out as the best common in the set with that win rate. And this one, this one's kind of sad because I think this is one that is something from a bygone era in a lot of ways. So yeah, I used to love this kind of creature, and I still like a creature like this. And what I mean by that is a creature that comes into play and bounces something. And that's exactly what the Journey Mage does. It's a 5-mana 3/2, bounces something when it enters the battlefield. A creature returns a creature to an opponent controls to their hand. And it could cost 1 less if you control a wizard, and it often did. It was often 4-mana 3/2, bounce on ETB, and it has the wizard creature type 2, which mattered in that format as well. But the bad news about this is bounce effects have gotten a lot worse since 2018. They always had their problems, the biggest being you don't want to bounce something with an ETB. But as Enter the Battlefield abilities have become even more common, bouncing a creature just isn't nearly as good as it used to be. It's not bad. This would still be a solid card, but I bet if you stuck it in any set from the last 2 years, its win rate would probably be in the high 50s at the very highest, and it's probably more like 57, 58. Back then, bouncing creatures was a much bigger tempo play. You were bouncing things that mostly all they were stats and keywords. We were already seeing lots of ETB back then. We've seen gradually more, basically ever since Visions came out back in the day. That was the first set with Enter the Battlefield abilities. And we've just seen more and more of it every year, but we sort of reached a critical mass of late where, I don't know, it seems like half of commons have some sort of value they generate on ETB at this point. And so a creature like the Journey Mage bouncing something, all you're getting is some tempo, but you're giving your opponent another ETB. That's rough. It is an effect that's always good against tokens, and there are still some creatures out there that are just all stats, but, think about Thunder Junction. The big green creatures that you would have been really happy to bounce in most sets in this format, gain 3 life when they enter the battlefield, or draw your opponent a card when you target them. So, things like that, that's just the text that commons creatures have on them now is usually geared towards generating some kind of value in one way or another, even if you can remove it or interact with it. And that makes a card like Journey Mage not nearly as good as it used to be. It's not a perfect comparison because this card is significantly worse, and it would have been worse in Dominaria, but we do have a 5-mana 4/4 that bounces something on ETB in Thunder Junction. The problem is it only bounces a tapped creature, and that's a world of difference from what Academy Journey Mage is at this point. But Journey Mage used to be great. It would still be a pretty good common, especially, if this was always 4-mana 3/2 bounce something, it's good. Adding to the board and subtracting from it is good still, but there are way too many situations now, and you'll know this if you've played with bounce cards lately. There are way too many situations where you're like, I don't really want to bounce anything, and that's going to hurt a card like Academy Journey Mage. All right, at number 8, we've got a War of the Spark card, Aan Eternal's Cruelty. This has a win rate of 61.8% in War of the Spark. And yeah, this is just a super pushed removal spell. Up until Thunder Junction, removal felt like it had started to slip, especially removal that costs more than 1 or 2. It really hasn't been that good lately for some of the reasons that I just talked about Academy Journey Mage. Things have Enter the Battlefield abilities, things have death triggers, things have stuff going on. They can do stuff from the graveyard. They have all sorts of stuff going on that makes it so trading 1 for 1 isn't quite trading 1 for 1 anymore. But we have seen in Thunder Junction, there's a 4-mana exile target creature removal spell that's one of the best commons in this set. It doesn't have a high enough win rate to be on this list. No card from Thunder Junction, no common does from Thunder Junction, if you're wondering. But it has, I think it has the second highest win rate of all commons in the set. And so we're seeing the same sort of thing can still work. And Aan Eternal's Cruelty, 3-mana instant, -5/-5, almost kills everything, and it exiles, which is important. That's part of what makes the 4-mana removal spell in Thunder Junction as good as it is. At least it shuts off the death triggers, even if it doesn't shut off ETBs. It shuts off recursion, and Aan Eternal's Cruelty does it too. Overall, it's a better card, probably, than the 4-mana removal spell we have in Thunder Junction, because it does the same thing most of the time, and it's easier to cast. It can't quite kill everything in the same way, but it gets pretty close. But yeah, just premium removal. That was really, really good. All right, next up at number 7, we have an Innistrad Midnight Hunt card. It's Oregon Hoarder, which comes in at 61.8%. Yeah, this was a ridiculous common. You know, some of these you might have forgotten about, you know, like Healer's Hawk or whatever. It's been a while, but it's pretty hard to forget about Oregon Hoarder and Innistrad Midnight Hunt. It felt like the best common in the set. A set that also had Diregraph Horde, which didn't quite make this list. It was like number 12, I think. So it didn't quite make the list. It was also an insane common. But Oregon Hoarder was even better with its 61.8% win rate. And this is the kind of card that makes removal and bounce effects and stuff just look like garbage, like I was talking about. It is 3 generic and a blue for a 3/2. Enters the battlefield. You look at the top 3 cards of your library, put 1 in your hand and the rest in your graveyard. So, if you kill that, how do you feel? Not good, because your opponent already got a card out of it, so that means you just got 2 for 1. If you bounce it, you feel even worse, because you're giving your opponent this powerful trigger again. And then, you know, on top of all of this just being good in a vacuum, this has 2 things going on that were extra insane in Innistrad Midnight Hunt. First, it's a zombie, and blue-black was like the best deck in the format, and had lots of cards that said, you know, if you have zombies in play, this is better. It's a zombie. Great. So on top of just being a great value card that generates a 2 for 1, that's awesome. That's, you know, makes it really good. Then, graveyard stuff was massive in every single blue deck in the format, whether it's blue-green, blue-black, blue-red. They all cared enough about the graveyard that most of the time when you played Oregon Hoarder, you kind of felt like you got a 3 for 1, because you would put 2 cards, you know, you'd get 1 card into your hand plus the Hoarder body in play, and then you'd put 2 things in your graveyard that there's like a pretty good chance that one of them has some sort of effect you can use from the graveyard. There's a pretty good chance you can generate value from it being in your graveyard. And so Oregon Hoarder was like this perfect, you know, assembly of all of these good things. Like, you know, if you take away its creature type and you made the ETB only like look at the top 3, put 1 in your hand, and the other 2 on the bottom in a random order, it would still be an amazing card. Like, it'd probably be close to the best common in the set, but then it has a creature type that's really heavily supported, and it has graveyard synergy in a set where it was like the thing you were doing in practically every deck. So, yeah, I mean, this was a really good common. To be honest, I'm a little surprised it wasn't even higher on the list when we went into it. But, you know, you'll see some of the stuff ahead of it, and it's not that surprising for the most part. All right, at number 6, we've got Claim the Precious. So this is from the Lord of the Rings set. 1 generic and 2 black sorcery, destroy target creature, the ring tempts you. So, you know, the ring tempts you really, really, really overperformed in this set. Like, nobody went into the set thinking it was going to be as good as it is, but it was really good. So any card that had like a real effect plus the ring tempts you ended up being great. And this is sorcery speed murder plus the ring tempts you. It felt pretty close to a 2 for 1 a lot of the time. First of all, you had lots of cards in the set that said, when the ring tempts you, something happens, so you get some extra value. And then the ring tempts you inherently gives you value, because you get an effect attached to one of your creatures that progressively gets better, and all of the effects had synergy in the format. Being a legendary creature had value, looting was really strong. Like, the buff that you got from Claim the Precious was a big deal. And so a lot of the time, you'd cast this, and it would feel kind of like you killed something and added to the board, because your creature was augmented in one significant way or another, or you got a trigger from a card that says, when the ring tempts you, X happens. So, you know, it's not a full-blown 2 for 1. Like, when you first cast this, if the rest of your board is empty, you know, it's not going to feel that good. But the ring tempts you had this sort of snowball effect on games. Getting that snowball rolling or upgrading the ring tempts you effect on your creature was really important in the format, and was like kind of what the whole format was about, which, you know, Flavor Fleet, good job, I guess. It did make things feel kind of samey, because it wasn't just black that was like this, like every color was into the ring tempting you, and, you know, it wasn't that interesting of a format overall. But a card like Claim the Precious that's just like reasonably efficient removal, plus basically a card of value, you know, maybe 3/4 of a card of value, we could call it. Hard for that not to be an excellent common, and it definitely was. Next up, we have a similar card. It's Blood Curdle. So this is our 3rd black removal spell at common to make the list, which is pretty interesting. This one is from Ikoria, and it's 3 generic and a black for an instant. Destroys a creature, and you put a menace counter on a creature you control. This played a lot like Claim the Precious, or I should say Claim the Precious played like it because this came before. But yeah, I mean, it's a reasonably efficient removal spell. 4 isn't like an ideal amount to pay for destroy target creature, but it's an instant, and that helps really make up for that. It's also not that hard to cast with only 1 black mana symbol. And yeah, you upgrade a creature in a real way a lot of the time. I mean, a menace counter is legit, and it's permanent. You know, that was one cool thing. We see it sometimes. Ikoria had a bunch of keyword ability counters. We see them on occasion now, usually on like planeswalkers and stuff, and rares and mythics, I guess. But that's a huge upgrade. Like, this would still be pretty good if it says target creature you control gains menace until end of turn. Like, that'd be like, okay. But permanently gaining menace is a big deal. And, you know, oftentimes this basically lets you kill a creature and made one of your creatures unblockable for the turn, and then also made your opponent have to account for 2 creatures for, you know, the rest of the time that you had the creature around. So, yeah, Blood Curdle was just a great premium removal spell, and it's the third and last. You know, the list doesn't continue with premium removal spells from here. But the thing that all 3 of these have in common is, you know, they're super, super efficient, and they give you some other effect. I mean, I guess that's less true of Niels Cruelty, which the exile is the big extra effect, but that is a pretty, on today's common black removal spells, that's a pretty important line of text that you kind of want, because at least you can get around graveyard stuff even if you're not stopping ETBs and stuff like that. Right, we do have another black card next though, but it's a different kind of black card. It is Toll of the Invasion, which had an impressive 62.3% win rate in War of the Spark, so it's our second War of the Spark card. So this is a sorcery for 2 generic and a black. Target opponent reveals their hand. You choose a non-land card from it, and they discard that card, and you amass 1. So this was really interesting because this is one I know I underrated. We see, you know, it's coercion, basically, 2 generic and a black. The first part of this card is what coercion is. And that kind of card has not performed that well in Limited. You don't add to the board, and you trade 1 for 1. You do get to take whatever your opponent's best card is, which is nice, but you're the one who spent mana, you're the one who chose not to do anything for a turn, you know, to do it. And if it's a top deck in the late game, it doesn't do anything usually, right? So that makes coercion usually a bad card, and I wasn't super high on this. But the way I should have read this card, because it has a mass 1, is that it's a 3-mana 1/1 with this ETB, because that's how it felt most of the time, and that is a way better card, like way better, because now you do add to the board. You're not taking a turn off from doing something. You are adding something to the board, even if it is a small body, or potentially you're buffing an zombie army you already have in play, right? Either one is pretty good. And, you know, getting to take your opponent's best card was good too. And War of the Spark was a format where you had the time to, more often than not, to take away powerful cards from your opponent for longer in the game than usual. And so this ended up feeling pretty close to a 2-for-1 most of the time between the body you get and the disruption effect. And number 3, we've got Inspiring Overseer. This is one that won't really surprise anyone who was playing during New Capenna, I don't think. 62.3% was its win rate. Yeah, so 2 generic and a white, 2/1 flyer. When it enters, you gain a life and draw a card. So we're seeing this sort of 2-for-1 theme continue. You know, a lot of the cards that have been on this list, they're either hyper efficient or they give you a 2-for-1 like effect or a full-blown 2-for-1. In the case of Inspiring Overseer, we're talking full-blown 2-for-1 because you add a very real body to the board, one that can attack plenty effectively for much of the game, and can also block X2s and kill them. That also happens to have drawn you a card. So, you know, you get a 2-for-1 right up front. It's a lot like Oregon Hoarder. You know, it ends up playing out very similarly, except its body is more relevant for longer in the game because of flying, and the fact that it's cheaper makes a huge difference. Games where you could go like Inspiring Overseer, play another Inspiring Overseer, were particularly stupid. And yeah, I mean, there's not much more to say here other than that this is just like an absurd value card that it didn't even have that much synergy in the format, but it didn't really matter, you know, because it's just a good card. That's what's kind of funny about Oregon Hoarder is it had special synergy in the format, and it still doesn't have as high of a win rate. Now, comparing win rates from different sets, which is what I'm doing in this video in general, it's not a perfect way to look at things because the overall win rate on 17 lands is a little bit different, but I still think it's sort of driving home the point, like how much better Overseer is even than Oregon Hoarder, because it had like very little synergy in the set, just a great card in a vacuum, and it would be in any set you put it in. All right, so now things are going to get a little weird, especially if you weren't playing during Strixhaven. So number 2, we've got Expanded Anatomy. It has a 62.7% win rate. For 3 generic, you get a sorcery that puts 2 counters on a creature and it gains Vigilance until end of turn. Yeah, so if you looked at this card in the vacuum, didn't know anything about how it actually worked, this would not be a good card. It wouldn't be a good card at all. But Strixhaven was a wild set, and it had one of the coolest mechanics, one that I desperately hope we see return at some point, and that was Learn and Lesson. So if a card had Learn on it, it meant you could grab a lesson out of your sideboard. You could also choose to rummage, that is, discard a card and then draw a card, but normally you grabbed a lesson out of your sideboard. And the cool thing about this format was you had to draft these lessons. You had to make picks with the intent of making sure you had lessons. And the reason this ends up being so powerful, despite the fact that in a vacuum, Expanded Anatomy is a card that doesn't really give you a full card worth of value. It gets pretty close, probably. 2 counters plus Vigilance usually means you have a good attack and block that you didn't have before. Sure. But it also has this big problem where if your opponent kills what you target with it, then you're in a huge amount of trouble. Things like that. If this were just always a card that you could only have in your deck, it wouldn't be very good. But you basically have all of these lessons just stapled to all your cards with Learn. And the good cards with Learn were like 2 mana, 2/1. Learn on ETB. Things like that. And so you're getting like a card worth of value already out of a 2 mana 2/1, and then you grab something like this out of your sideboard, right? And this adds a permanent buff. The Vigilance is not permanent. It's not a counter like we saw with Blood Curdle. But it is a permanent buff from the counters. And oftentimes, what this basically amounted to, especially like in the later stages of the game, you'd play like a 3 or 4 mana card with Learn, and then you'd still have enough mana left over to just cast Expanded Anatomy right away. So it's sort of like adding a kicker cost to a card and getting, this effect out of it in a lot of games. And this buff was often enough to make a creature into a much better attacker. You could putting it on life linkers and flyers and things like that was always great. But it is really wild, like looking at this card in a vacuum. If you never played Strixhaven Limited, didn't know how Learn Lesson worked, this would be like the weirdest. You would never understand. You'd think data had to be wrong. But the way this thing played out was that it was just great. Expanded Anatomy was incredibly strong. Just having the ability to grab this out of your sideboard when you drew, one of 10 cards in your deck was a huge deal. And so the interesting thing about this card would, because it's only going to register on 17 lands as game in hand win rate if you grab it, right? So the situations where you don't grab it are important too, because all of your other lessons have different effects. So you have this toolbox that you have to choose from, and you're only going to ever grab Expanded Anatomy when it's advantageous. So you don't really see what would happen with this card if your opponent has mana up and a bunch of ways to interact, because you're not going to grab it if that's the situation. So you end up being able to only grab a card, any of these lessons out of your sideboard, in the optimal situation, because you have so many options, generally speaking, because you've drafted, hopefully, 5 or 6 lessons that all have different kinds of effects. Some of them are removal spells. Some of them make creature tokens. None of them, well, most of them, there's a few exceptions, most of them aren't insane like in a vacuum, but when they are an effect that is effectively tacked onto every card in your deck with Learn, that then lets you tutor up, whichever one is best, they all end up having really insane win rates, because you're not going to grab them unless they're good. So that's how Expanded Anatomy ends up being a card with 62.7% win rate. And at number 1, we've got Aan Eternal, which also has a 62.7% win rate. So 2 generic and a blue, 2/2 flyer, amass 1. We see this card all the time, and it's always good. There was a similar one in Dominaria United, was it? The 2 generic and a blue for a 2/2 flyer that makes a 1/1. That card's just always good. This one was especially good because it had some extra synergy. You know, Amass was like a deck in the format. So, and actually multiple decks. Worked well in multiple decks in the format, whether you were sacrificing and amassing over and over again or building one big army. So this is another card where it's just, you know, it's a 2-for-1. You get 2 cards worth of value out of it. So it's been an interesting top 10. You know, we have cards that are all over the place, different kinds of cards. You know, the ones that are 2-for-1s mostly occupy the top part of the list, with Expanded Anatomy sort of a weird outlier because of how Learn Lesson worked. But for the most part, we saw cards that give you some sort of full card worth of value up front and then deliver some sort of additional value, whether it's a menace counter or a 1/1 token, or tempting the ring, any of those sorts of things. That just results in a good comment. You know, getting 2-ish cards worth of value out of one card is pretty much the best way to win Limited, and it's always been that way, and it's going to continue to be. Alright, so that does it for this video. I hope it was interesting for you. If you enjoyed it, please like it and share it. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.